just bear with us on things like the audio and the live stream, and use the microphones when you're asking questions. I'm thrilled that we're able to host an event here that follows a series of lectures and workshops with Bruno Latour, who's been very generous with his time and his work with the Brown Institute. It's, I think, going to be quite a special evening for those of you who are interested in this really fascinating area of how we start to think about and map what we do in the digital space. I'm going to let Fergus, who's our senior research fellow here at the Town Centre, introduce Jonathan and Liliana, who are sort of rooted to the spot as we fall off the stage. You have your own microphone. So Fergus will talk to you about what we're doing this evening. Please sign up on the Town Centre site if you haven't already to get all of our events. You know, we have regular, not always as glittering as this, but we have regular events in this space. And we have lots of opportunities to be involved with us, both as participants in events like this, but also as fellows as well. If you have research in place that we can to bring into us and spend more time in this long campus with it. So with that, Fergus, over to you.
Okay. So thanks. Thrilling to have Liliana and Jonathan here. So the underlying context for this is that as journalists, a crucial part of the role is to understand the world around us so that we can accurately report it and accurately kind of interpret it for our audience and explain it to the communities. So with that in mind, it's been a huge amount of fun thinking about how to think about Liliana and Jonathan's subject and how to introduce it. And riding around on the subways last week, if you just go one slide forward, more technology works, amazing. I saw this advertisement for the march that was yesterday, and you're going to have to forgive me if I'm radically simplifying in the order of this illustration, but what you've got here in this ad is a kind of assertive model of what's happening around climate change. You've kind of got an idea of some actors in there. You know, you've got the marchers and the world leaders, and you've got some action, which of course, the march which was on Sunday, and there's a world summit going on, and there's kind of relationships and causation which is kind of swirling all around in there. So it's this is an ad on the subway. It's not journalism, but it's still crucial for journalists to understand these players and to be able to kind of hold a map of the sphere of climate change in their heads. And that's kind of where Liliana and Jonathan's research direction fits in. It'll potentially help journalists with the reporting and analysis part of their process. And it's especially great to have this project come along now because it kind of complements some of the other research that's happening at the Tow Centre. Two of the Tow Centre's research fellows, Michael Keller, who's with us today, and Brian Abelson, have got a great project running called Newswings, which is being built to capture and analyse digital and offline impacts of journalism, kind of further along the value chain of journalism than what Liliana and Jonathan are talking about. And then you have a fantastic report by Nicholas Diakopoulos, which was an exceptional brief that was there to help journalists with tools to report on the algorithms which increasingly influence our lives. So it's a nice combination. You can kind of see how there's a combination and a complementary relationship between what these guys are talking about, what Michael's talking about, what Nick's talking about, and some of the other research that the Tow Centre is doing. If you go to towcentre.org, you can see some of that research. Okay, so the way that today will run, the 45-minute presentation from these guys, we'll have a discussion section after that. We are live streaming, so Mike and I will be pulling microphones around to make sure that we kind of get you, and then there'll be a short response from Professor Latour. So, Liliana and Jonathan. Liliana Bounegru is a PhD candidate studying data journalism at the University University of Groningen, and the University of Ghent. She's also a researcher at the University of Amsterdam, where she works on the Digital Methods Initiative, the basis of today's talk. In addition, she's the Data Journalism Program Lead at the European Journalism Centre. Jonathan Gray is a doctoral researcher at the Royal Holloway University of London and Director of Policy at the Open Knowledge Foundation. He is co-founder of the Where Does My Money Go project, which is where'smymoneygo.org. It shows UK citizens how public money is spent. The Open Spending Project, which maps government spending in more than 60 countries around the world, and the award-winning Europe's Energy Project, which shows progress towards European Union green energy targets. So we're thrilled that they're here today, and that they'll be working with the Tau Centre for the next 3 months to develop their ideas and work. Welcome them, and please enjoy the presentation.
Thank you. So we're very happy to be here, and first of all, a big thank you to the Tau Centre for inviting us to come over and give this talk, and to the Brown Centre for hosting us in this beautiful new space. We're very pleased that our visit coincides with Professor Latour's week at Columbia, and delighted to have him here as a respondent later in the discussion. The issue mapping approach that we're going to be presenting today can be seen as a way to operationalize Professor Latour's work on actor network theory, which is something that we're not going to go into now, but which we'll perhaps discuss a little bit more a little bit later. We started off thinking that we'd present 15 things about digital methods, illustrating why digital methods might be interesting for journalists, and highlighting what is distinctive about digital methods with reference to 5 innovations, and closing with 5 opportunities for using digital methods in journalism. But as we were preparing our talk, we thought perhaps 15 was a bit passé, a bit too even, and perhaps we should try to learn from the viral magic that is BuzzFeed and pick a number more like 17. So we ended up adding a couple of reflections to make it up to 17 things. So without further ado, let's move on to the first 5 stories.
Great. So our first story. So as I'm sure you all know, today UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon is hosting a climate summit here in New York. And to coincide with this event, we thought we'd make our first story about climate change. So this story is about using digital methods to map the dominant themes and countries in 18 years of UN climate negotiations. The events that we focused on are known as the UNFCCC Conferences of the Parties, or COPs, and there have been 21 of them so far. So it has been widely reported so far that there has been a shift in climate negotiations in the past years from mitigation, which deals with preventing climate change by acting on its causes, to adaptation, which focusing on adjusting to the consequences of climate change. And this shift is known as the adaptation curve. So what we did in a project called EMAPS, or Electronic Maps to Assist Public Science, which was undertaken by Sciences Po in Paris, the University of Amsterdam, and a few others, and is coordinated by Professor Latour. We wanted to see whether this report of a shift from mitigation to adaptation as an approach to climate change was confirmed by the transcripts of the negotiations for the past couple of decades, from 1995 to 2013. And to do that, we produced 2 maps. The first one is a network of expressions that appear together in the same paragraphs of the negotiation transcripts from 1995 to 2013. And what this map shows us how adaptation-related issues are connected to mitigation issues in the negotiations, but also more generally what the main themes of the negotiations are and how they relate to each other. So what we found through this co-occurrence analysis and clustering exercise was that mitigation is the more dominant theme in the negotiations than adaptation. So we have around 7 of the 12 or 13 clusters that are dedicated to mitigation. Mitigation is also much more diverse and distributed as a topic, and includes discussions about topics such as reducing emissions and the Kyoto Protocol on the cluster on the left side, clean development mechanisms at the top. Another cluster is dedicated to fuel and the transport sector, and is closely related to energy and technology transfer. At the bottom, we have a cluster on land use and forests, as well as RED, which is a mechanism for reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. We also see the few, around 3 adaptation clusters at the center of the map. So these are much more tightly connected. They are connected with a lot of other topics, which is why they have a central position on the map. We see that talk of adaptation is focused on environmental and social impacts, vulnerability and adaptation, and the important question of funding and equity. Moving on to the second map in this project, we also looked at the evolution of the negotiation topics over time. And Sciences Po and Density Design Agency in Milan created this graphic for us, which shows the attention given to different topics across the different climate negotiations. So the topics that you see in this map correspond to the topics present in the clusters of the previous map, and their visibility is computed based on the number of paragraphs in which at least 2 terms from the same cluster are present. So basically for what you see at the top are the different COPs, so the different conferences of the parties, which are the annual meetings of the members of the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And we see that for each COP, the highest flow, the highest stream corresponds to the most visible theme, while the lowest one corresponds to the least visible. So what we found from this analysis is that both adaptation and mitigation are highly visible in the negotiations. From the very beginning, mitigation has been a top priority in the negotiations agenda. So most of the streams that start at the first COP deal with mitigation. We also see that generally less attention was given to adaptation in the earlier negotiations, with one important exception, and that is adaptation funding. So adaptation financing has been central to climate negotiations from the very beginning. So in summary, there has been indeed a shift towards adaptation, with focus specifically on vulnerability and adaptation funding during the period that we examined. But maybe this shift is more complex than the phrase adaptation term used in the media and in policy circles implies. So to conclude, this approach and the outputs of this mapping enabled us to trace patterns and relationships that may not have been obvious from official press releases, expert opinions, or following debates. A third map that we produced in the same series of mapping climate change negotiations looked this time at the countries that intervene most in the negotiation. And this is a topic that is widely reported in the media every time a conference of the party happens. But what we did was to take a slightly different approach. So we again turned to the transcripts of the negotiations as provided by the Earth Negotiations Bulletin, which is a service of the International Institute for Sustainable Development. And this time we calculated the number of paragraphs in which the name of a country appears. And the result of this exercise is a flow diagram which shows the number of interventions of the top 21 most active countries in the negotiations. And again, the flows are sorted according to the number of occurrences of each country. So for each COP, the COPs are listed at the top with the flag of the country which hosted them. So for each COP, the highest flow corresponds to the most visible country, while the lowest one corresponds to the least visible one. And what we see in this map, so how we read this map, is that there is a notable stability in the presence and intervention of countries. So most countries tend to maintain their relative rank throughout the COPs. There are a few notable exceptions, like Bolivia, which is the stream in dark purple.
Can I find it? Is it that one? I can't quite see. They're online.
And the Philippines, which is light blue, which also increases in the last COPs. And these countries are vocal mostly on loss and damage mechanisms as well as compliance with greenhouse gas emissions. The most active countries throughout all the editions of the COPs are China. So the three countries that you can see at the top are China, which represents the G77 group, the United States, and Europe. And we also notice that countries tend to be more active when they host an event. So Germany tends to be more active during the first conference of the parties in Berlin, and Japan in the third one, which took place in Kyoto. We also worked with Wired, Italy, to turn these digital maps into some beautiful printed maps, which were also featured in an exhibition in Rome. So they were on the streets of Rome in an exhibition hosted, a beautiful infographics hosted by Wired. So to conclude with this story, so this project gave us another way to analyze the dynamics and outcomes of the negotiations, which went beyond the manual analysis of promises, speeches, and press releases, which is the more common approach, and sometimes gave us unexpected results.
So our second story, of 5, is about mapping the rise of the right, particularly the far right in Europe, utilizing digital traces from the web and social media. As you may know, over the past few years, there have been widespread concerns in the media and generally about the rise of far-right groups in Europe who made significant gains in European national elections. Some commentators have also expressed concerns that populist right parties may also be contributing to the recruitment drives of more extreme far-right parties. So a series of projects at the University of Amsterdam sought to find out more about, first of all, the recruitment methods of far-right groups, whether countermeasures that were being taken currently were proving effective and were appropriate to the recruitment methods that were being used by far-right groups, and which groups were interested in which issues, and which issues were sort of most active across Europe, and whether and how extremist far-right groups were connected to more mainstream populist right groups across Europe. So the research group profiled right-wing formations in 13 European countries, according to the web. To do this, they made a comprehensive list of URLs of different populist and far-right groups per country, and used link analysis software, which was developed by the University of Amsterdam to analyze relationships between them, and then they analysed the resulting networks, looking at the issues and actors that were most prominent within some of these different networks. And they also did a network created a network of organisations who are countering the rise of the far right in Europe. Overall, they found that there are indeed new kinds of far right groups emerging that are significantly different from the right-wing politics and issues and formations that you saw in the past. Interestingly, there are new sets of issues which are becoming more active. So the environment, anti-globalization, and human rights were three sort of perhaps less expected sets of issues which are gaining prominence amongst more extreme right-wing groups. And there were new recruitment techniques. So you'd see people recruiting through festivals, social media, and magazines, as we'll see in a moment. Another thing that we found is the countermeasures that were currently being deployed to combat the rise of the far right were not keeping pace with the activities of these groups. So, for example, in Denmark and in Norway, the far right are increasingly mobilized by counter-jihadism, while the countermeasures tend to focus on more traditional forms of fascism. We also found that Islamophobia generally is predominantly located in northern countries like Denmark and Norway. So just to walk through some of the country-specific findings, in Greece we found the most significant website is that of Golden Dawn, which you can see, I think, this one. An extreme right-wing party that entered the parliament in the 2012 elections. Among their activities are things like helping the poor, accompanying elderly people to the bank to collect their pensions in impoverished areas of Athens where there are higher populations of migrants. It organises public events exclusively for the Greeks, asking people to donate genuine Greek blood. And another website for women asks readers to buy local products and visit local organic markets. So this is something new and distinctive about more recent far-right sort of extremist groups that perhaps was not obvious to the people who are trying to combat the rise of the far right. They have, for example, this very odd magazine, which is for the racially conscious home, for sort of specifically targeted, I guess, women, which is something that maybe counter-extremist organisations didn't anticipate. In Hungary, we found that the extreme right movements and organisations focus on nationalism, nativism, as well as anti-Roma and anti-Semitic sentiments. It appears that cultural heritage festivals have become a major focus for recruitment, and Hungary's supposed roots in Mongolia have been appropriated by the far right through yurt recruitment festivals, leading some of the researchers to suggest that countermeasures should include reclaiming the yurt as a symbol, not as an extremist symbol in Hungary. So finally, in Serbia, we found that there is a growing number of right-wing civil society organisations, including think tanks, which seek to shape political and public opinion about the future of Serbia, particularly around topics like land and Kosovo. And these think tanks, you can see one of them here, are an important site where the populist right, which you can see on the right-hand side, connects with more extreme far-right groups. So these think tanks act as a conduit between sort of the populist right and sort of more extreme groups. And here you can see one of their websites. So another thing that we looked at was specifically drilling down into counter-jihadist groups on social media. And during the trial of Norwegian mass murderer Anders Breivik, it was reported that counter-jihadist groups sharing similar views to Breivik were on the rise, which was a great cause for alarm in the wake of those events. A British campaign group called Hope Not Hate released a report surveying the different counter-jihadist groups in Europe. I guess we were interested to see whether and to what extent these counter-jihadist groups were connected across Europe and if they formed a European, a pan-European network, as it were. And to do so, we identified their Facebook groups, extracted their friendship connections between members, and imported this into social media analysis software, and were thus able to discern how organizations cluster based on the friendship of the members of their Facebook groups. Overall, we found, so you can see some of the clusterings, these are sort of different groups here and the relationships between them. We found that Facebook is indeed an important medium for extremist groups. More than half of the organizations from the expert list that we started with used Facebook as a significant means of communication. We also identified 3 main clusters based on geographical proximity. You can see there's a sort of French group here, and an Italian group here, and a Scandinavian group here. The Norwegian Defence League seemed to be highly connected and play an important role in an emerging European network. And finally, and alarmingly, European counter-jihadist groups are indeed networked and transnational. So moving on from this, we're interested to see if we could identify who new leaders were for some of these different online groups. And traditionally, I suppose this would be ascertained through things like going to physical protests, but we wanted to see what could be established using digital traces from the web and social media. And to do so, we compared lists of offline leaders as compiled by NGOs working on this issue to lists of online leaders and ranked them according to the number of connections across different groups. And we're thus able to identify some of the best connected leaders in this emerging group, in the emerging world of counter-jihadist social media groups. Overall, we found that offline leaders are active on Facebook, and the administrator of Facebook groups often corresponded with the offline leaders represented by the counter-extremist NGOs. But also, there may be new emerging online leaders that that were not previously known about, and this led to the development of a technique for identifying online leaders.
Great. So moving on to story number 3. This story is about the phenomenon called care drain. Maybe have people here heard of care drain? Maybe raise your hand if you have. Yeah, a couple of people. So to give a bit of background, so care drain is a phrase coined by a sociologist, Arlie Hochschild, in 2002 to refer to the migration of health workers, often women, from developing to developed countries, a phenomenon which leads to deep inequalities in the provision of healthcare between North and South, between rich and poor. So a 2008 paper highlighted the fact that the so-called physician-to-population ratio varied significantly between countries, with the UK having more than 1 doctor for every 500 people, while Malawi has 1 doctor for every 50,000 people. Similarly, in 2011, a Guardian article reported that there were more Malawian doctors in Manchester than in Malawi, and more Ethiopian doctors in Chicago than in Ethiopia. Hence, in 2011, a global code of practice was established by the World Health Organization and others to set up voluntary principles and standards to discourage what they described as unethical practices around the migration of health workers. And what we did at the Digital Methods Initiative at the University of Amsterdam, we decided to look into who in the UK health sector, the UK being one of the major destinations for health workers from countries susceptible to care drain. So who in the UK health sector was talking about countries in sub-Saharan Africa with health worker shortages. And the aim of this exercise was to measure the awareness and accountability of private actors recruiting workers in vulnerable countries, especially given this, this global code of practice that we mentioned earlier. And just to give you a couple of examples of what we found from this exercise. So what you see in this graph is, in a sense, the level of attention that each UK sector that deals with health gives to this issue. And what we saw was that the most vocal sectors in relation to the issue of care drain are the government and the academia. This issue is much less discussed in healthcare NGOs, and there is next to no discussion in the private sector, which is an important mediator in the recruitment of these health workers. A second sub-project that we did in relation to this phenomenon is to look at the recruitment of healthcare workers in Poland. And what we found here is that there is far more demand for Polish healthcare workers outside the country than within the country. So if we look at the graph, we see that, so this exercise was done based on job postings for Polish health workers in different parts of the world. So we see that at the moment of this analysis, Poland had 27 job postings for Polish health workers, so within the country, and there were over 200 job postings for Polish health workers to work in Germany. So based on this exercise of analyzing recruitment postings, we concluded that Poland appears susceptible to care drain, and this raises the question of whether regulation is necessary at European level to control this phenomenon.
Okay, and just to move through another very quick example, in 2010, WikiLeaks facilitated the leaks of cables from 274 US embassies, consulates, and diplomatic missions. A group of researchers at the University of Amsterdam were interested in finding out whether the embassies mentioned in the cables acknowledged the issue on their official websites. Basically, they created a list of the embassies mentioned in the cables and queried terms related to WikiLeaks and Cablegate in these websites with the Google Scraper tool, which they've developed. And they found that only 5 of the embassies explicitly acknowledged the leaks on their websites. And you can see sort of which.
Great. Moving on to our final story. So in 2007, the BBC scrapped plans for a major TV special on climate change, arguing that they wanted to stick to impartial factual content. And to justify this decision, the editor of a popular program, BBC program called Newsnight, argued that it is absolutely not the BBC's job to save the planet. And there was criticism to this. So critics argued that the BBC was capitulating to a small but vociferous group of climate skeptics lobbying against taking action. Hence, we wondered, while the skeptics seemingly had significant influence on shaping the news agenda, we wanted to see whether they had as much influence in key climate change spaces on the web. And to do this, we drew up a list of climate skeptics and climate skeptical organizations and used the Google Scraper tool, which we developed at the University of Amsterdam, to search for their names, so the name of the skeptics and the skeptical organizations, on websites that came up in the top Google results for climate change. And overall, we found that the influence of climate skeptics in the media was disproportionate, given their relatively marginal influence in key climate change spaces on the web. So if we look at one of the graphics that we produced, based on this resonance querying exercise. So we see that very few, basically 2 or 3 of the top sources returned for the query of climate change in Google mention the skeptics. And when we go and check in what context they are mentioned, they are in fact sources that refute climate skepticism.
In particular, SourceWatch is sort of tracks sort of lobbying and influence, and Real Climate tries to address some of the concerns of climate skeptics with climate scientists, yes, or other climate scientists, I should say. So now we're going to move on to 5 innovations of digital methods that we'd like to highlight. I hope that we've illustrated far from comprehensively a few of the things that digital methods might be able to add to the coverage of complex issues. While we're not suggesting that these innovations are exclusive to digital methods, the digital methods approach, of course, we would contend that they're not yet widespread in a number of different areas and are indeed underutilized in a number of different areas, in particular in newsrooms, as we'll talk about more shortly. So the first innovation is treating digital traces from social media and the web as data sources in themselves. So not just using the web and social media to look for content, for example, through social media feeds or search engine queries, but to look at what digital traces from these media can tell us about issues. So briefly, to step back a little bit, one of the main influences for this approach is Professor Latour, who argues in his seminal 2005 book, Reassembling the Social, An Introduction to Actor Network Theory, that the social is visible only by the traces it leaves. And while we're not going to delve into this further right now, suffice to say that part of the reason that we believe Professor Latour and his colleagues at Sciences Po are particularly interested in electronic media is that online interactions tend to leave digital traces which can in principle be captured and analysed to understand group formation around complex issues. At least that's our reading of it. Hence, we might understand web and social media data as digital traces of the social. And by this, we mean not just content, but metadata relationships and interactions. And so digital methods are, in the words of Professor Richard Rogers, methods of the medium designed to repurpose digital objects, natively digital objects, such as tags, likes, links, and hashtags, to study activity around issues. The Digital Methods Initiative at the University of Amsterdam and Media Lab at Sciences Po have developed dozens of tools to organize digital traces from the web and social media for the purposes of research. For example, there's a tool called NetViz, which extracts data from different sections of Facebook platform, such as profiles, groups, pages for research purposes, including metrics such as page engagement, friendship connections, and page-like networks. And if you haven't tried it before, it's very easy to just install the plugin and start downloading your own network and finding the unexpected connections between your friends or between pages and different things you like. It's very easy to use. Another thing is the Twitter capture and analysis toolset, so-called TCAT, which captures tweets and allows for multiple analyses, including statistical analysis, such as the most mentioned hashtags, most shared links, most active users, and so on, but also network analyses, such as co-hashtag networks, mentioned networks, followee networks, and so on. And I guess the crucial thing to mention in this context is that these tools let you analyze not only the messages that are being disseminated, but also the actors and networks amongst which these are being disseminated. So that's TCAT.
Yeah, the second innovation that we'd like to highlight is looking at how you can use search engines, not just to search for content, but also to look at what they can tell us about an issue or about society. And several researchers at the University of Amsterdam suggested this as a direction for research and formulated it as we look at Google results and see society instead of Google. So we took this on in a project that looked at what kinds of rights are most prominently recognized or referred to in different countries. So we did a project around rights, and to do this, we looked at the top 10 distinctive right types for over 30 local versions of Google. So basically, we searched for translations of the term right in over 30 local Google domains, so as a google.de for Germany, google.fr for France, and so on. And we found that different sets of rights were prominent in different countries, and that some of these countries had distinctive concerns. And to give you some examples, so this is the result, where you see each column is a country represented by their local Google domain, and each of the top results for the query rights is represented through an icon. So we identified the top 10 types of rights for each country and represented them through icons. And what we can see here, the black icons are the unique rights in for some of the countries. So, for example, for Finland, every man's right, or the freedom to roam, was a right that was specific to Google results for Finland. Prostitutes' rights were specific to the Netherlands. For Japan, we found that computer programmers' rights ranked very highly. And Italy was concerned with the right to oblivion, so the right to have personal data deleted. So from this example, we can see how we can use Google to learn something not just about how Google organizes information, but also something about the prominence and priorities of different issues in different cultures and societies.
So another, number 3, our third innovation, is the use of co-occurrence analysis to identify themes and issues. So in this context, we mean looking at how terms appear with other terms in digital traces from social media and the web, and using this to understand the composition of different issues and the networks of actors around them. An example of this is a project from the UN climate negotiations that we looked at earlier, where co-occurrence analysis was used to identify thematic clusters of discussion in climate negotiations, which is something that Liliana talked about earlier.
Great. So the fourth analytical technique that we'd like to highlight is using social network analysis to identify actors. So with digital methods, we can find new ways of understanding collectives by mapping networks of actors based on their interactions as a way to understand them as connected ensembles rather than as social categories, which is how we access them through statistical analysis. So this mapping process can help us to identify actors that we may have not known about before, as in the counter-jihadism project that we presented earlier, where we use social network analysis and particularly a metric called betweenness centrality to identify new emerging online leaders. To do this kind of work, we use an open source network analysis tool called Gephi, developed partly in collaboration with Sciences Po. This is a powerful tool for analyzing and visualizing these kinds of complex networks, and Gephi is actually really popular because it lowers the threshold for working with network analysis and visualization.
I think also, Sciences Po are developing an online version of it, which is super easy to use, which might be also interesting in the context of sort of media and journalists. But so our last innovation is analyzing hyperlinks to explore what we call the politics of association. We looked at this briefly earlier with the project on the rise of the far right in Europe, where we identified formations such as the right-wing networks with hyperlink analysis. The University of Amsterdam has developed a tool to assist with this called the issue crawler, which locates and visualizes networks on the web. One use of this tool is to identify a field network, for example, the network of far right groups in a given country. And to do so, it follows hyperlinks from a list of seed URLs. So you can see it's in here. And keeps them in the captures them and keeps them in the network. Only the websites that get at least 2 links from the original set of websites. And then it analyzes the linkage patterns between them to understand which sites are central and which are marginal in different issue spaces. Another use case for the issue crawler is to identify new actors and sources through the so-called snowball method, which enables you to retrieve all the pages linked to from a given set of links and retain all of them and compile them into a list. For example, this was used in the right-wing formations project to expand the initial list of right-wing organizations and far-right organizations that we had into a more comprehensive list. So another similar tool is being developed at Sciences Po, which is called Hive, which allows you to analyze linkages to and from particular elements of a website. This is a more slightly more granular tool.
Yeah, great. So we're now moving on to the final section of the presentation, opportunities for journalists, how we see these techniques to be useful in journalism. So a couple of years ago, Jonathan and I, together with Lucy Chambers, co-edited a book called the Data Journalism Handbook, which is a showcase of how journalists around the world are using data to enhance their coverage. And two years later, the book is freely available in over 12 languages, and it's used for teaching in a lot of universities and institutions around the world, including, as we found out earlier, in the new Stanford Journalism Project, which we're really happy about.
Last night.
So we're keen to build on this work with a new project looking at how journalists can use digital methods to produce the kinds of stories that we presented so far. And to do so, we want to convene leading social scientists with leading digital newsrooms to explore and experiment with how some of these research approaches, methods, and tools can be used to transform the coverage of complex issues in journalism. And this is something that we're really proud to be working on at the Tau Center for the next 3 months. So the Tau Center asked us to write a short white paper about the opportunities of issue mapping and digital methods for journalism. And without any further ado, so here are some preliminary thoughts about what we think about the potential of digital methods for journalism. First of all, we think that some of the techniques presented in this talk could complement methods that journalists are currently using to identify sources for a given issue. So, for example, the right-wing formations and the counter-jihadism project showed us how hyperlink analysis and social network analysis, and particularly between a centrality, can be useful in identifying prominent actors online. And sometimes the results may be familiar, as we saw from the counter-jihadism project. There was an overlap between offline leaders and online leaders, but sometimes this may lead to new or unexpected sources who are influential in different online spaces. So rather than simply relying on existing contacts or received narratives about a given issue, this technique of using hyperlink analysis or social network analysis to identify news sources has the potential to broaden journalistic sourcing practices and bring new voices and actors and new sources of expertise and insight.
So, opportunity number 2, which is 12 of our 17 things, is using social media and the web as data sources in themselves. As we alluded to above, this is looking at social media and web data as interesting sources of analysis and sources of insight in themselves rather than just the vehicles for dissemination of content. And this would complement other sources available to journalists such as official documents, interviews, statistical data, polls and surveys. So there would be basically an opportunity to broaden and enrich the base of evidence at the disposal of journalists to cover complex issues.
Yep. Opportunity number 3. So as we have seen, digital methods import forms of analysis from bibliometrics and scientometrics, and specifically citation analysis, as well as from social network analysis, and adapt them to the web. For example, in the form of hyperlink analysis, which we have seen that we've often used in the projects that we presented so far. And while these forms of analysis have remained largely underutilized in journalism so far, we think that they could give rise to new analytical opportunities in journalism, and it is one of the things that we would like to explore in our project.
And so number 4 is particularly relevant in the context of journalism, which is establishing the partisanship of a given source. So the climate skeptics example we looked at earlier illustrates how you can establish which sources give space to which actors in a given debate. A tool that we used to undertake this project, tool which was used to undertake the project by the researchers who worked on it, is named the Lippmannian device after the writer and journalist Walter Lippmann, who we had a brief discussion about yesterday, was briefly discussed in Professor Latour's talk. And the Lippmannian device can be used to examine which sources speak about a given issue, which I guess you could call the source composition of an issue, and which issues are mentioned by a given source, or the issue commitments of a particular source. We think that this kind of analysis of source partisanship has the potential to be a powerful instrument in journalistic investigation reportage that would complement other techniques and methods which are currently used.
Yeah, so finally, the last opportunity that we identified deals with the presentation of stories. We think that issue mapping offers journalists new opportunities for presenting complex issues to their audiences. And several of the projects that we've looked at have resulted in new graphics or data visualizations, such as the climate negotiation stream graph, or the network graph of counter-jihadist Facebook groups. Many of these graphical forms are obviously not new to journalism. Recently, Reuters produced the Connected China project. This is an interesting recent example of how social network graphs are used to help their readers understand the relationships between government, military, and the industrial elites in China. And the challenge, so we also see some challenges ahead, and the challenge of using these techniques in the context of journalism is to strike a good balance between observing these complex issues in all their richness and simplification to render complexity readable and relevant to the public. So riffing on Professor Latour's question, we would like to ask, what kinds of new visual forms might we imagine for representing complex issues in journalism? So the last 2 brief points before we move on to the discussion. So we wanted to leave you with 2 brief reflections. The first one, so while one of the dominant metaphors in journalism related to what journalists do, and especially what investigative journalists do, is digging. With digital methods, the focus is less on uncovering relationships, less on uncovering hidden structures or pieces of information which are hidden or submerged, and more on tracing. So we're moving from digging to tracing to tracing relationships, to tracing associations and networks on the basis of evidence that is in plain sight, but which might nevertheless lead us to unforeseen insights and conclusions. Yeah, so for social sciences research, as we've seen from some of the work that the University of Amsterdam and Sciences Po are doing, we see that there is much to be gained from tracing associations in this way. And we'd be very interested in further exploring the potential of these techniques in the context of journalism as well.
So finally, the very last thing is just as a kind of thing to reflect on before we moved into discussion, is to draw a comparison between mapping physical geographies and mapping issues around social formations. So Harry Beck's acclaimed 1931 redesign of the London Underground map, which I'm sure some of you must know, is a striking example of how certain features are foregrounded and certain features are relegated in order to assist travellers on the tube. So you can see there's a kind of abstraction and formalization, and it takes on a different shape for the purposes of assisting people who are navigating the system, from the color to the shape and all this kind of thing. And I guess the question is, what might we learn from the construction and design of geographical maps that might inform the mapping of issues and the social? So what features might be highlighted and relegated for different purposes and for different audiences? What might issue mapping practices look like in different fields, and in particular, what might be instructive about this analogy when it comes to think about issue mapping for journalism? And I guess one of the things that we were interested in doing is seeing if we could produce a productive collision between epistemologies, as it were, or ways of thinking about knowledge and information, and practices of journalists on the one hand and social scientists and social researchers on the other hand, to see what we can learn about how to improve the coverage of complex issues, events and controversies in society. And so that's a list, 17 things, there they are. Thank you.
So the question and answer format's relatively normal. Stick your hand up if you've got a question. Wait for the mic from either Michael or myself. And if you wouldn't mind just saying where you're from as well as your name before you ask your question. Are there any that spring to mind immediately? I'll give you a couple of moments to think about it.
And perhaps we could also give a chance to Professor Latour to say a few words.
Professor Latour, do you want to respond now or towards the end of the session?
Oh, I think we'll give a discussion.
Wonderful. So one of the things that kind of struck me is the question of accuracy of the conclusions of your mapping processes. And I was wondering if you could just say a few words about how you what the process might, some of the processes might be of verifying whether the digital traces, how accurate and meaningful they are.
Yeah. So the way we do this kind of analysis is through a method which we call cross-platform analysis. So we look to ground our findings online by analyzing an issue across different spaces. So the particular interest that the Digital Methods Initiative at the University of Amsterdam has is in the notion of online groundedness. So we're interested to see what pictures, what can we learn about culture and society by using the web. And whereas there are different approaches to verifying online information, if you will. So for example, the famous Google Flutrends project grounds its findings offline. So it compares symptoms, findings made by tracing symptoms from queries that, that people make in different parts of the world with official medical data, so with records of visits that people make to the doctor. What we are exploring is a form of online groundedness where we don't go back to the offline, so we don't go back to a traditional source of information like government data to ground our findings, but we go and see how we might, what picture of an issue we might get in, say, Google News compared to Google Blogs compared to Twitter or Facebook.
I guess there's also consultation with experts, and I think there's also an interesting question about what we mean by verification. I guess one of the thing could be to look at the extent to which digital traces are representative. So that, and that's a whole sort of another bigger question. I guess broadly speaking, there is a shift in thinking, the sort of theoretical background, a shift from the sort of traditional statistical notion of moving from sample to population to looking at the digital traces and looking at the digital networks, not necessarily in terms of their representativeness. So you actually look at the things themselves in their specificity. So, but it's an interesting question.
Hi, thanks for that. Chris Anderson, City University of New York. So I was thinking about your distinction between digging and tracing, which got me further thinking about, as you were sort of going through your cases, I was immediately thinking like, okay, what here would journalists find to be the most interesting? Like, what would they write about if they were seeing this? What would they write about in terms of a story? Which then got me thinking about the differences between what journalists might find interesting and what social scientists would find interesting, which is sort of your epistemological clash. So here's an example. Who speaks, who's pushing climate issues, right? For a journalist, they would probably have a headline like, Bolivia rises in climate discussions, right? Whereas a social scientist would be perfectly happy saying, it's the same people who are talking now as were talking 20 years ago, right? Like, I can't see a newspaper headline saying, you know, same as it was, you know, 12 months ago, same as it was 24 months ago, same as it was, you know, 36 months ago. So how do you, how do you deal, so which is better, I guess, is my actual question. Like, is it better for the news organizations to focus on what they usually do, which is the unique, the new, the unusual, right? Or should social science see its job as sort of reforming that, that tendency to always focus on the next new thing?
I guess it's a very interesting question. I guess part of the point of the project would precisely be to affect what we hope to be a productive collision between various different ways of looking at things, various different epistemologies and values. I think one of the brief sort of comment I would make is that with new forms of digital journalism and data journalism, there is sometimes a shift away from, and this is exactly, Liliana should really be answering this question, this is exactly our research, between sort of traditional sort of news values of recency and human interest and so on, towards sometimes more sort of structural features. I guess my feeling is, another thing to say about that is, digital methods might not just contribute to the breaking news process. So you don't need to just think of this approach as something which will, you do as a project and then you find a headline and story and then you write it up. But actually, we think could be a very useful asset to have in the newsroom as background to reporting on complex issues and events. So, for example, when it comes to the negotiations, to understand what happens in Paris next year against the background of 20 years of debate, to understand where those changes are taking place. I guess another thing which we kind of indicated a little bit in the talk was we think it's perfectly possible that digital methods could be valuable even if it doesn't change the epistemologies or values of newsrooms whatsoever. And I guess that would be things like identifying news sources human sources. So when it comes to, again, to use the example of negotiations, issue experts, who knows about this very sort of obscure issue which has suddenly risen to prominence, who we can talk to from different sides of the debate, who's central around this particular problem question, who's marginal. So that's, I don't know if you wanted to add.
No, I think.
It is an interesting question of the director of Data Journalism. Why is it not used to say, I've just discovered that this thing has not changed in 25 years because it's the same people? I mean, isn't there a way to make it quite an amazing story? Look, the fact is so amazing and it's still exactly the same people doing nothing for that. Why is it not used?
And I think there is a way to yeah. Yes, that's a great point. I mean, I think there is a way to rhetorically frame it and to frame it so it is more consonant with traditional news values, right? To say, to rhetorically and visually describe it in a way that does more closely align it with the way that journalists see as their sort of dominant mission. But I would suspect that it would be a slightly harder push to get many journalists traditionally to frame it in that way, rather than simply saying, look, here's the newest, because journalism ultimately is about what's new, right? And it's an extra step to frame what has been all the time as new, rather than simply saying, look, there's Bolivia. So I would agree, they're not contradictory, but I do think that within traditional journalistic epistemologies, one is slightly harder than the other. But I think you're right. I mean, it's not impossible.
Hi, I'm Laura Kervin. I teach actually in the architecture school, but I run a mapping visualization lab as well. And I think what you've given is a really fantastic overview of opportunities for digital media and storytelling. But I want to go back to Fergus's question and ask you two questions, right? Which I think where does computation come in, and where does design come in? So I think accuracy, it's not that journalism is about telling good stories, and it's about bringing to focus important stories. So we hope that you're accurate, right? So the accuracy of the digital media I don't think is the most important thing. It's the neutrality or the non-neutrality of the tools. And so it seems to me that you guys are using a lot of found tools, which means that you're using a lot of other people's algorithms. And so where do you sit on that question? Because I think that sorts out the accuracy question, or margins of error, or biases. Do you want to work with? Do you think you should be working with computer scientists as well?
I guess one thing, just to immediately say on that second point, I'll let maybe Liliana answer the first bit, but it was on the second point, I think I'm not sure it was this paper or the NetVis paper, but Professor Bernard Reeder at the University of Amsterdam occupies the unique position of being both the developer of many of the tools that we are talking about and a social scientist and researcher himself. And I think it might be this one or the NetVis one, where he precisely talks about this issue of basically the gap between tool producers and people who are doing the analysis interpretation.
I think there's a big difference between programmers and programming, and I think you're great at programming. Obviously, you're not, but I think that gap produces a really important space that we need to.
Yeah, so the way we do this kind of work, so the procedure that we use for all of these projects is a method which we call the data sprint. So we bring together in a week specialists of different sorts, so everything from new media analysts, social scientists, graphic designers, and programmers to work together on these mapping projects. And we don't draw clear lines between where analysis stops and where design starts. In fact, we have been able, so we work in our project with density design, a design lab at the Polytechnic in Milan, and they are in fact witnessing over the past years a changing, how the role of the designer is changing from intervening in the last phases of a project and working on presentation to actually being involved from the very beginning in the analysis process. So a lot of the analysis that we have been doing for this project, particularly the social network analysis, are being done with the designers from the very beginning. And this process is iterative. The process of analyzing, using visualization to explore data, drawing some conclusions, and redoing analysis is being done in a number of iterations during this.
We're very encouraged also when we were in Paris the week before last in a meeting with one of the developers there, that he was increasingly well versed in Professor Latour's work, and was thinking in terms of actor network theory when it came to developing the next iteration of a tool that they were looking at. So he was thinking in terms of, I mean, he'd obviously spent sort of his own time sort of reading up on actor network theory. So again, it's increasingly fuzzy, I think, for some of the people involved in many of these projects.
I think Laura's question was more at the point, not about the role that designers might play or when they're involved. The graphic itself, the algorithm that produces the graphic is embedded with a fair bit of its own bias, but cast not bias in a way that's going to be conservative versus liberal or something like that, but biased in a way that this picture, this ball and stick model that doesn't have axes and we don't quite know what the dimensions are, right? That it has its own storytelling power, and understanding what went into the underlying algorithm that gave rise to that, and can be considered a very complicated thing. I mean, I'm telling you things you know, but I think Laura's question is a little bit more than just asking how designers are put in, but we often stick the visual to the design there, and really what I think she was asking about was the underlying algorithm and how one builds maybe trust in that image that's there, and if you're expecting people to be reporting from it or using it as an anchor.
I guess just to say one thing on the back of that, which I think is a very big question for people who are doing this kind of research, is precisely as you say, not only the algorithmic accountability, as it were, of the tools which are being used to extract digital traces from the web and from social media. I think in some way you can try and offset those things by making sure that, for example, all the source code of the tools that are developed by Sciences Po and the University of Amsterdam is open. It's all open source, and the developers are also working closely. There's not such a sharp division of labour between developers and researchers were saying. But I think one of the bigger issues, in a way, is algorithmic accountability of the web services and social media services from which these digital traces are derived. And I guess that sort of comes back to a much broader question, and sort of typical sort of like new media sort of question is how do the media format the networks? How do they format the emerging structures and patterns of behaviour that constitute interaction, and not just it's not just a secondary thing. It's actually how people increasingly interact, which is
and I guess instead of seeing this as a bias, we turn it into a question. So part of our project is always asking the question: how does the medium that we use, whether Twitter or Facebook, organize a specific issue? So we are a media studies department, so we are equally interested in issue mapping as we are in studying the medium and studying its specificities and how different flows of information get to us through different kinds of media. So this is always a question that is part of our study design.
And not just trying to minimize the translation that's involved or the change that's involved, as it were, but try to understand that translation, I guess. I don't know if that answers your question a little bit.
My name is Bruno. I'm a student here at the University in the Master's degree program in journalism and computer science. And I would like to ask you about the tools that you presented. Especially, I'm interested in the Facebook tool that was developed in San School. And I'm interested to know what data it can use, the one is able to access, especially according to privacy restrictions. Because you said something about friends, connections, and usually a user has to provide this data to the API or the application. And I would also like to know a little bit about the hyper tool. I'm not sure of the name, but to elaborate a little bit about it, because I didn't understand its use, and also where can find these tools.
So Netviz is an application built on top of the Facebook API, and it allows you to extract information from personal networks, from pages, as well as from groups. And the kinds of things that that you will, for example, for personal networks, it will extract the friendship connections. For pages and groups, it would extract all kinds of engagement metrics. So likes, comments, liked comments. For pages, it would for pages it extracts information. It's able to create what we call the page-like network. So how pages like each other. So it's an official app built on top of Facebook, which means that it complies with the terms of service of the Facebook API, and privacy is built within. Privacy compliance is built within the Facebook API. On top of that, we as researchers need to ask ourselves ethical questions. So we as researchers, as well as Bernard Reader, the developer of this tool, had to take ethical decisions as to what the app should allow. And for example, one of the decisions that was taken was to anonymize notes. So to anonymize people. So when you get let's say members of a group, you don't get the name of the person, but you get an ID. So each person is turned into an ID. And in the case of the counter-jihadism project, so the one where we used Facebook to identify online leaders, so that is a case where we had to have some discussions and think about the ethics of this project. Basically, think about what is the higher good. So do we take a decision based on privacy and decide that we don't want to publish the names of these new leaders without asking their consent, or do we take a decision based on other higher goals for society and decide that this is something that should be known because this is a phenomenon that needs to be monitored? And in the sense, so that is more of an editorial decision. So that is something that is something that you can get different answers to, also depending on what country you're in. So in Europe, the decision was that yes, it's important. There are important findings. We need to publish them. Maybe in the US, the answer would have been different, and we would have taken a different decision. Right. So that's the issue crawler. Yes. So basically, the issue crawler is network allocation software. So basically, what it does, it's able to identify networks on the web by following hyperlinks. So it starts with a list of seed URLs, and it follows links, it follows outlinks from that list of seed URLs, and keeps only those websites that receive at least 2 connections from the list of seed URLs. So this is one version. So basically, this is what we call co-link analysis, and we use this to establish a field network. So, for example, if we want to see which is the health and development, who is part of the health and development space in Europe, we would use this method to identify the field.
Liliana and Jonathan will be having a blog post up on the CAP website later this week. We'll have links to all of these resources. There's one final question after that before we come for a response, because we are getting close to time.
Hi, my name is Rupert. I'm a student here at NS. My question, first of all, thanks for the talk. My question is, oftentimes the personalities of people are different from their online persona, specifically on social media. And something you said earlier is that you want to move away from the offline more and more in terms of sourcing. So I'm still, like, my question is, how do you basically reduce, I don't want to use the word again, but how do you reduce that bias of somebody's actual persona versus their online persona?
Yes, so I guess your question is situated in a particular phase of internet research, a phase where where you look at the web, you look at the online to study online behaviors, and the move that our research group makes and the proposal that it makes is to look at the web and see culture and society. So to see the web as part of culture and society, not as a distinct realm that is separated from a real realm. And
so what are the 3 things again? There's sort of virtual,
like cyberspace,
yeah. And then
virtual societies
virtual
and
societies.
digital methods. Yeah, and yeah, and I guess another way to answer your question, you always design a method to access a behavior. Yeah, and even when you want to access the offline behavior, it will be mediated by an instrument, by a method that you use to access that behavior. So in a way, we don't we see our methods as different ways to gain views on an issue, in addition to other more traditional methods that you might be using. Yeah.
Well, actually, this last question is very important, because one of the difficulties, I think, for what I understand from the discussion, is that I'm not sure tracing and digging will work very well, because the social that is traced is not the same as what traced before by other sort of form of information, statistics, polls. So there's a point of realism here, is that the idea that the digital method is studying the same social world as the one that was studied by other means, like interviews or like food work or statistics. I think it's slightly wrong. I mean, every single new media is actually producing a new society, as you said. I mean, the fact of having a persona on the web is interesting itself as a way of having another psychology, probably other traumatism as well. So it's always a danger. I think that might be journalists, I suppose, are associated with a certain realism in the description of the world. And the social scientists are not so realist. They are ready to use lots of other tools to get what appears first and not very realistic. But I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for. I have nothing really much to contribute except to support the work which is done in the media here, and the connection. I'm the disciple of Gabriel Tarde, who in 1898 wrote that the journal of the future will be only statistics, basically, but we will have learned to read and the statistic will be so refined, and the visualization will be so good that watching the news will be opening the newspaper as well, on television all the time. Opening the newspaper, you will read things which will be as nice as the flight of a girl. It will be as precise as that. People will have no text, we will have only statistics visualized. And he was writing that long before there were any data. There were actually very primitive statistics at the time. He was the head of statistics. And Tal is, of course, the inventor of academic learning. So you will love your talk, because all of these new digital methods are a way of associating completely different connections between the way science is produced, because after all, big data is there, activism, and the way you represent issues, particularly Italian aspect of journalism, and politics. So we have a nice test, which I hope we will be able to develop in this year, which is the Paris Climate Conference, where we hope to be able to collaborate pretty closely with your two centers in this only place, into journalism. Well, we have two centers in digital method, right?
Yes, we have. We're very, very good friends.
At two different levels. And I hope we will be able to, but it will be a marvelous test. It will be in Paris, Sciences Po is right in the middle of Paris. We hope to have a sort of digital newsroom where we can bring things coming from science, the natural sciences. This is the part I'm supposed to for sure. And to see what, because there are lots of connections between the two invented by social scientists, by geographers, geophysicists as well. So the idea, of course, is trying to merge those visualizing tools and those data crunchers together and see if we can make stories out of that, which is, of course, your job, but it's also our job, you know. Because scientists, interestingly enough, natural scientists now are talking a lot about making stories, because we have been, because of the attack on climate, they suddenly realized it's not enough to have data, we also have to have stories. And I was actually writing a grant application with a geophysicist, and I put a description of territory, and she said, no, you have also to add to the title storytelling about the territory. And I said, this is my job to be storytelling, it's not your job. She said, no, I'm a geophysicist, and I want the story to be told. And it's very important because people tell stories about our volcanoes constantly. We cannot just have data. So the big difference between the people who produce data, the social scientists, and the journalists, I think is slightly changing. And that this sort of wave that we're trying to capture with Bruno Latour. So I support that. I'm not specialist for that question at all, and we are much more specialist. But we can collaborate.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Latour. That's a great moment to end on, this moment of convergence that we have here. And also, congratulations that Nate Silver was being described 100 years before Nate Silver existed. Liliana, Jonathan, thank you so much. Great to be working with you. Great to be working with you, Professor Latour. Thank you, Mark, for letting us in here and move the chairs around. It's very cold, yes. It's not like it is in Europe where we have no air conditioning. It's a new thing to be cold in summer. I hope to see many of you at future town events. If you're particularly interested in this project, do get in touch either with me, Emily Bell, Director of Town Centre, or with Jonathan Liliana, whose details we'll have on the site, and we're both on Twitter with slightly obscure handles, but if you look at the stream from the town centre, you can follow both as well. Thank you very much indeed.